She looked away first, and you read that as nothing. That single moment, that quiet flicker of her gaze dropping just before yours met, has cost more men more real connection than anything they ever actually said out loud. Because what most men are never taught is this: the way a woman looks at someone she is deeply attracted to almost never looks like attraction. Not on the surface. Not in any of the ways you have spent years learning to recognize. What it looks like, from where you are standing, is something far closer to the opposite. She glances away. She looks down. She finds somewhere else to look for just a half second too long. And you read that as disinterest, as confirmation of what you already feared. But what her eyes are actually doing in that specific moment carries a meaning you were never given the vocabulary to understand. And that missing vocabulary has quietly changed everything. Think about every time you tried to read her interest level through her eyes. You probably looked for the obvious signals. Eye contact held a moment too long. A gaze that lingered and announced itself without apology. The kind of look that leaves no room for misinterpretation. And when you didn't see those things, you concluded there was nothing to see. That logic feels reasonable. It feels almost obvious. But it is, in most cases, almost entirely wrong. The way genuine attraction moves through a woman's body is not a signal sent in one clean, readable direction. When she feels something real, something that actually moves her nervous system does not broadcast that feeling the way you would expect. It does something far more complicated. It partially conceals it. Because deep attraction in a woman activates something that functions more like vulnerability than confidence. And vulnerability, at its most instinctive level, triggers one primary response: protect first. Reveal only what feels safe to reveal. This is not performance. This is not strategy. This is her emotional system doing what it does when something actually matters, which is to manage the exposure of that feeling before she has decided what to do with it. Her eyes become careful precisely because what's behind them is not careful at all. Because what she is feeling in that moment is real enough to make her guard it. This is why the signal she is sending looks nothing like the signal you have been trained to look for. You were scanning for openness. You were waiting for confirmation. And she was experiencing something she wasn't yet sure she wanted you to see. What you read as absence was actually intensity, moving quietly, just beneath the surface. But this is where it gets darker. The first thing to understand is what her eyes actually do under the specific conditions of real, involuntary attraction. Not surface-level interest, not casual appreciation. The kind of attraction that catches her off guard. The kind she didn't choose to feel, and which is therefore harder to perform and far easier to misread. When a woman is genuinely attracted to someone in a way that reaches past the surface, her eyes do something that looks counterintuitive until you understand the psychology behind it. Instead of holding contact at the peak moment of feeling, they briefly look away. Researchers who study social signaling call this a gaze aversion response. And it is not a sign of disinterest. It is a sign of emotional intensity that the body is momentarily struggling to contain. Her looking away is not withdrawal. In most cases, it is the clearest evidence that something real is actually happening inside her. The physiology behind this is direct, even if the implication feels surprising. When emotional intensity rises past a certain internal threshold, the kind that comes with real, unguarded feeling rather than performed interest, the brain activates a brief inhibitory response in its attention system. The gaze breaks because processing something genuinely affecting requires a fraction of a second of internal redirection. She is not looking away from you. She is briefly turning inward to manage what you just made her feel. And then she comes back. Think about what that means. The behavior most men read as the absence of attraction is, in many situations, its most honest expression. There's a second signal that lives in her eyes, and it is one that almost no one talks about. It has to do not just with where she looks, but with how her eyes behave when she believes you are not watching her. Women who are deeply attracted to someone will often observe that person during moments of distraction, when you are laughing at something else, when you are talking to another person, when your attention is pointed somewhere other than her. And the moment you turn back, her eyes move away. Fast. Not because she wasn't looking, but because she was, and got caught somewhere she hadn't decided to be yet. That quick look away when your eyes finally meet is not the behavior of someone who feels nothing. It is the nervous system managing the accidental exposure of something it hasn't yet decided how much to reveal. This is dopamine reward loop behavior in its earliest social stage, the tension that lives in the space between anticipation and confirmation, which is neurologically more charged than the confirmation itself. She is not bored. She is in the phase where the feeling is still live, unresolved, and exactly as electric as it is going to get. If you have ever had a woman become quieter, slightly more careful, slightly more contained right around the time the conversation started to feel real, that is the same mechanism in motion. The closer to feeling, the more internal the processing. The more the eyes move inward before they return to you. And this is the part most people completely miss. The third signal is the one that requires the most emotional depth to decode, because it doesn't live only in the moment of eye contact. It lives in what happens to her eyes in the instant just before she speaks to you, and in the instant just after. When a woman is attracted to someone and is about to say something, or has just finished saying something that mattered to her, watch for the microsecond shift. Her gaze drifts slightly, or moves softly to the side, and then returns. That is not distraction. That is self-consciousness. That is her briefly checking herself, making sure what she just said, or what she is about to say, did not reveal more than she intended. It is the eye behavior of someone who is internally slightly undone, and doing the quiet work of keeping that invisible. Women who feel nothing in an interaction do not do this. They hold eye contact easily, because there is nothing inside them to manage. The moment you see that small, almost imperceptible drift and return, that soft break in the steadiness, you are looking at someone whose inner world is not neutral in your presence. Not even close. There's a fourth signal, and it is the subtlest of all. It lives not in where she looks, but in the quality of how her eyes change. The slight involuntary softening at the outer corners that precedes genuine emotion. This is not something she chooses or performs. The soft corner shift that appears just before a real smile is an autonomic response. It occurs outside of conscious control, the same way breathing changes when you feel something you didn't plan to feel. The softening at the outer corners appears slightly before she even processes that she is about to smile. It is the eye moving ahead of the face, and it is something that cannot be rehearsed at the level most people operate at socially. This is the signal that disappears in 2 seconds if your attention is in the wrong place. And it is also, consistently, the most honest thing happening in the room. The more you understand these 4 signals individually, the more clearly you begin to see that they rarely appear in isolation. They form a pattern, a quiet language running beneath the conversation, beneath the social performance, beneath everything she is managing on the surface. And that pattern has a rhythm. The look away at the peak of feeling, the return gaze when she thinks you're not watching, the microsecond drift before she speaks, the soft outer corner shift before the smile. Once you know what they mean individually, you start to see what they mean together. What they mean is that something real has been happening inside her, and it has been happening longer than you realized. Here is something worth sitting with before we go further. How many moments do you think you have already misread? Not as an abstract question, specifically. How many times has a woman been quietly signaling something real to you while you were scanning for something louder, something obvious, something that looked more like what you already understood attraction to be, and you walked away certain she felt nothing? Because that gap between what she was experiencing and what you were equipped to see is not a small one. For most men, it is the entire space where genuine connection either forms or quietly disappears without explanation. You were not failing to read her because something was wrong with you. You were reading her with the wrong vocabulary entirely. And there is a significant difference between those two things. What comes next changes that vocabulary permanently. And here's what nobody talks about. The real reason men miss these signals is not simply a lack of information. It goes deeper than that. It is rooted in how most men have been conditioned to recognize attraction through the lens of their own emotional expression. Men generally communicate interest through presence and directness. Eye contact held steady, a lean forward, a gaze that says something without apology. And so, without realizing it, they look for those same behaviors in her. They wait for their own signal to be reflected back. And when it isn't, they conclude the absence of their pattern means the absence of feeling. But women who feel things deeply often move in the opposite direction. The more something genuinely affects them, the more carefully they manage the outward expression of it. Not out of dishonesty. Out of an instinct for self-protection so deeply built in, it barely registers as a choice. She has learned, often through real experience, that revealing too much too soon is a form of exposure that can cost her in ways she cannot always predict. So her eyes move carefully. They drift. They look away at the moment of peak feeling and return after the intensity has passed enough to feel safer. They reveal in glimpses, not announcements. The real loss buried inside this misread is not just the missed connection in the moment. It is what she concludes when you don't respond to what she was quietly showing you. When she signals something genuine and you don't respond because you didn't recognize what you were looking at, she does not think you missed it. She thinks you saw it and felt nothing. She concludes she experienced something alone, in a moment that should have been shared. And that conclusion, of feeling alone inside what should have been a mutual recognition, is one of the quietest and most final forms of emotional distance that exists between two people. And that is where the silent shift begins. But there is something that happens in the rare moment when a man finally does see it and lets her know, without words, that he did. That quiet acknowledgement, that subtle return of presence in exactly the right instant, creates something between two people that almost nothing else can. She has been seen at a frequency most people never even tune into. And that kind of being truly seen reshapes everything that follows. The eyes are never quiet. Not when something real is happening. They speak in a register that is constant, layered, and running at a depth that most people never learn to access. But now you know where to look. Not for the bold signal, not for the obvious announcement, but for the brief drift and the soft return, for the gaze that finds you when it thinks it won't be caught, for the slight softening that moves a half second ahead of her smile. This is not about gaining an advantage over someone. This is about developing the emotional depth to be present at the level where real connection actually lives. Because the women who feel things most deeply are also the ones who signal it most quietly. And the men who can read that quiet are the ones who stay in her memory long after everyone else has faded. But what happens inside her when she realizes, for the first time, that someone finally did see it, that is a silence that carries a completely different kind of weight. And that story begins somewhere else entirely. One question before you go: has there been a specific moment, one person, where you now realize she may have been showing you something you didn't have the language to see at the time? Where you walked away thinking she was indifferent, and now that same memory feels like something else entirely? Say it below. You already know the one.